Welcome to Trending in Education, an exciting future thinking version of today's episode. I'm joined today by Charles Beyrouthy, who is the managing partner at a venture capital firm called Forma Prime. They put on a really exciting event at the Brooklyn Navy Yard that I was lucky enough to attend. And through that, I followed up with Charles, and I have him here today. Welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. The thing I keep coming back to is Thomas Kuhn's structures of scientific revolution, paradigm shifts, where, you think one way and then there's a shift and suddenly you're thinking a new way. I feel like we all collectively have been through that around generative AI. And that's something that's been a topic on Trending in Ed pretty routinely. But we haven't really looked that far ahead. And that's where I think some of the stuff that you're doing, this was a deep tech conference. We're going to talk about, quantum computing and new sensor technologies, new cybersecurity approaches that are really kind of transformational. So buckle up, listeners, and thank you for joining today, Charles. We'll get into all that and we'll get into more of Forma Prime and the work you're doing there. But before we do that, we always like to start with you. Can you catch us up with your backstory, how you got to this point in your career?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. That's where I studied chemical engineering, biochemistry, and molecular biology. I actually fell, and I say this literally, into chemical engineering by accident.
Okay, hopefully it wasn't like a vat or something when you say you fell into...
It was actually snow.
There you go.
I had entered UMass Amherst as a pre-med student. That's how I got admitted. And then, as part of the program, you actually have to pick a major in addition to majoring in pre-med or going along the track. And then I accidentally slipped on ice after a chemistry lecture, came out, and I happened to have met a professor named TJ Monziaris, who is now the department head of the chemical engineering department at the University of Houston. And he brought me into the notion of applied chemistry and the applied capabilities of some of these concepts, both on the chemistry side, the biology side, and also, taking it from the mathematical side. And then as I entered into my freshman year and then into my junior year, eventually I entered a lab that was at the Silvio Conti Polymer National Research Center. And so I worked there for a professor who was basically targeting work in the microfluidics space.
Okay.
We were doing work on the interfaces between silicon and how to be able to mimic some of those phenomena for the diagnosis of cancer and AIDS patients, and being able to use everything from animal cells to silica particles to being able to create flow cells, right, from using this phenomenon. Eventually, I completed my honors thesis, left, and then ironically ended up in oil and natural gas consulting.
Okay.
Of all places. So I decided not to go to medical school. I decided not to grad school. Ended up there. And then after that, spent some time over there working in the Middle East, between the US and the Middle East. And then after decided I was going to run a startup.
Yeah. So that progression there, it sounds like you're kind of going almost further into the engineering and application side of emerging technology you would have learned as a pre-med. You're now going a little deeper into practical applications, and then applications that are, more central, I guess, to the broader world around us.
Yeah. So I started a lab software, co-started it with a co-founder, a company called Lab Cloud, which was specifically a tool for research and development companies to be able to manage everything from their LIMS to their inventory, procurement. And it was a very interesting lesson, I will say. I mean, the company is still running, obviously.
Yeah.
Exited, and I think there may eventually be an exit, but it was a very interesting lesson for me because what it meant is that it showed me the value of the scientific life cycle, right? Both in terms of how people are innovating, how people are thinking about operations, the repeatability of experimentation.
Yeah.
And just honestly, the pipeline, right? We experienced at the very early stages of what Boston had become in terms of biotech center, right? As a hub, if you will, one of the early in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you've seen for example, Colorado emerge as the key quantum hub.
Yep.
Right? But if you go down Main Street in Boston, I'm sorry, in Cambridge, excuse me, I need to be very careful with that,
Yeah. Careful. You're up there.
right? Especially since my office is on First Street. I hope they don't cancel my lease. Right? You go down there and you start to have the conversation about, well, what does it mean to, to actually be able to take something from the IP, centric type research,
Yeah.
the actual commercialization. And you started to see really key VC firms like Flagship, Polaris,
Hmm.
and some of those real, Third Rock Ventures as well, Atlas. They really came in and stepped up as a key funding source, but they didn't act just as a funding source. They were also acting in an operational capacity, right?
Right.
Placing executives, they were
Right.
placing accountants, consultants,
Hmm.
placing all of these different scientists who
Yeah.
from industry, right? Obviously, you saw the pivot where companies like Pfizer, Merck, AstraZeneca at the beginning of like the 2010s really started to take R&D off the balance sheet and moved it more into operational R&D,
Yep.
i.e. how to make drugs cheaper.
Yeah. Less of a what, more of a how.
Exactly. And so we started to see that. So I saw that phenomena throughout the 2010s and how it transformed Boston and how it ended up coalescing all of these different parts of the ecosystem, everything from property, right? So
Hmm.
to obviously build up all of this lab space to accelerators, right?
Hmm.
Like Lab Central, right? You take a look at all of the institutions being involved, MIT, Harvard, Boston University, UMass Amherst, all of those institutions being keenly involved, right? And then obviously the supplier base, right? With companies like Thermo Fisher,
Right.
now,
It's,
right, Avantor and others who
yeah.
really try to really add an engine to that ecosystem.
Yeah.
They understanding that when the startups grow, they're able to grow with them.
I think it's an important point for my listeners who may be thinking more about education. And this is a place where, we talk about the education ecosystem, which it is,
Yep.
but I got a more like first principles level. You're talking about the actual, like, this gets back to maybe your engineering understanding. And we will get into quantum for those of you who are excited about that aspect of the conversation. But there is like, it's both the what and the how, I guess. And the how requires an entire system and systems thinking, which is another thing that has come up a bunch when we talk about the ways of thinking that are going to be important for people to cultivate.
Exactly. And so what I'm getting at is when I looked at all this, there was just this real fundamental understanding of perfect example is MIT, right? In terms of their tech transfer and how they ended up really seeding a big part of that ecosystem. So for example,
Hmm.
professors like Bob Langer, right, at MIT, but also professors at Harvard like George Church, right, who
Hmm.
are keenly involved in taking, the technology that they developed from the lab and bringing it to a actual investable state.
Yes.
And that process really started to really invigorate, I would say, the cadre of the professorial group
Yeah.
at MIT and in these various institutions to take example from that
Hmm.
and move that forward. But it also was a little bit of a change in dynamics because what it also meant is there was an impetus for professors to now really produce grant money
Hmm.
to continuously move some of that research along because
Right.
stakes actually became very key parts of some of
Right.
the elements, right?
Right.
Uh,
Hmm.
take a look at a company like Moderna, which had spun off, but was very dormant for some time. But the technology became the most applicable during the COVID-19 crisis, where
Right.
it ended up becoming one of the core vaccines, right?
Right. Hmm.
For what ended up probably saving millions of lives.
Right. Right.
Question now is, where are we going from here?
Yep.
So, I ended up after, a number of years at the startup world, I ended up going to the banking world.
Yep.
And one of the things that I learned when I was in the banking world was what does it actually take from the other side? What
Hmm.
does it actually take for certain technologies,
Yeah.
some level of commercialization?
Yeah. Even when you spoke before, that sounded like almost a mental model out of like the banking side, where you're like, at what point is this investable? Like, at what point can we actually do that?
That is 100% correct. And so we start to look at that and we say, all right, what does it take in a bank, right? What does it take for the process to go through that where you're able to take in, let's say there was a big movement with FinTech, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
FinTech was bringing in various tools like chatbots, artificial intelligence. It was looking at various widgets to be able to address things both on the customer side
Yeah.
and back end,
It's
right?
in the last like 10 years, right? Something like that.
In the last 5, 6 years,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Even earlier than that, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
really, you started to see some really big FinTech funds
Yep.
merge out of like, call it the 2016, 2017 phase,
Yeah.
right? And they started to really double down on it, on banking anyway.
Hmm.
And at some point, you started to say, wait a minute, where does this all go? And there becomes this really, really interesting scenario of how banks were adopting technology. So my job is
Mm.
really to say, okay,
I
great,
see.
educate the ecosystem inside of the bank
I
about
see.
what's happening. On the other side, you still need to get business line buy-in in terms of being able to take the technology and go, put that
Yeah.
in place, right? And so there's obviously the proof of
Interesting.
concept side,
Hmm.
right? And on the other side, we've got the actual implementation.
Yeah. This is where, I'm an old test prep guy. We used to talk. I didn't let them say eat our own dog food. This is where you have to drink your own champagne, is the way I would frame it. But it's like within banking, I didn't realize that angle into it as well, where there was innovation within banking itself. And then how do you understand how that kind of plays out?
Well, it's a highly political process, right?
Hmm.
So it's like you have an innovation team and you have a tech team, and then
Mm.
you have even the guys who are in the business line. And at the end of the day, right,
Yeah.
this really interesting model where BCG, McKinsey, Bain, they started recalibrating some of the corporations, right, to have where the business lines were the ones that were the most empowered, and
Yes.
technology teams became
Hmm.
really cost centers.
Yes.
And so innovation teams have sort of found themselves in the middle. So that's why you saw, for example,
Hmm.
Barclays Accelerator get capped,
Yeah.
Innovation Lab get capped. All
Hmm.
of these various groups just start
Yeah.
getting challenged because of that. But then what really got fun, and this was really what I found really interesting, is that you then started to look at what is the intellectual property moat
Mm.
on some of these companies. And you realize that in many cases, especially when you talk about SaaS, when you talk about some of the API frameworks, all of that, much of this stuff that was being built in FinTech and it still is really built on off the shelf stuff.
Yeah.
At some point, you look at this and you're like, wait a minute. So then who can do this?
Right.
Then you're starting to have a lot of the big consulting firms that have some of the tech driven centers
Yeah.
in other parts of the world, right? That made a decision and they said, you know what, we're going to build instead of buy.
Yeah.
So anything, we now have a solid ideation state around
Yeah.
things could look like, and that's what the fintech ecosystem has given everyone.
Mm.
The next problem becomes, well, now that we know that, great, why don't we build it ourselves, or why don't we build an iteration of that by ourselves?
Right.
And I
Mhm.
started to see that firsthand. And I started then to see the IRRs and the traction of fintech companies just start crashing because, right now, the business line said, I don't need to have a license. I can own it and I can build it the way I want to build it.
Yeah.
We've got the tooling and the people enabling me to.
Yep.
And so the CTOs really started to capitalize on this because now it drove them towards a engagement model where they didn't have to have this dependency on a third party to build technology.
Hmm.
So eventually, after working under the CIO of the consumer bank, I ended up leaving the bank and I started Forma Prime. And so when I realized obviously this opportunity, and I had started talking to some of my colleagues in the semiconductor space from a while back, talking to some of my lab mates, right, who many of whom either went into other careers, went into on the tangential side of semiconductors primarily. Well, why? Because in the last, since I want to say like 2008, 2009 timeframe, basically all innovation and all manufacturing in the semiconductor space was not in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
was solely in Taiwan.
Right. And if I recall right, the day that the deep tech event happened at the Navy Yard was just prior to the tariffs really coming, Liberation Day, but it was like right before then.
That's
And
right.
that was where this was it's very central to conversations around the technology that you're investing in.
Absolutely. And I'll get to that point in a moment because it's a great point you brought up. But what we looked at was that the companies like Intel, companies like, so many others were just not upskilling here in the United States. There
Yeah.
were some
Hmm.
R&D centers, but most of that was being taken abroad and it was being taken in other contexts. Obviously, China was a big
Yep.
market, right? And at some point, as we became a more digitally enabled society and also more digitally enabled country, especially from the national security side, right? Where
Yep.
now, if you look at the conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, you see these are now based on asynchronous warfare, where it's not just about being able to use conventional weapons like guns and shells. You're now talking about, drones. You're now talking
Right.
about underwater aircraft. You're now
Hmm.
talking about autonomous systems in terms of cybersecurity, right? You're talking
Right. Hmm.
signal intelligence. All of these are digitally enabled.
Yeah.
And so you then ask the question, well, what powers all of these components? And what you realize is it's all chips.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, as fate would have it, when I actually started at the bank, I got a very interesting magazine in my mailbox. And it literally says,
Chip wars. Yeah.
this is a copy from The Economist from the
And,
20th.
and for our listeners, yes, exactly. It's The Economist, and we're not talking about Frito-Lay. We haven't made that far of a turn. We're talking about semiconductors. For those who are watching Forma Prime, Charles's backdrop is very much in the processing, GPUs, NVIDIAs. That's very much stuff that I think is top of mind for folks when they think about this stuff.
Exactly, 100%. And so we go into the whole dynamic of how do we then take on the next generation of these components, right? Because
Right.
to say this is really important here.
Hmm.
Because every single thing we're powering here is extremely well thought out, right? From
Yeah.
a chipset perspective,
Hmm.
but it's also essential to these various functions. And
Hmm.
so then we started to, as we were launching the firm and making some of the pitches, people were asking us, well, what is the timeline for some of these components to come out, right? What are
Right. Hmm.
research in terms of implementation and whatnot? And so we actually realized a very fun fact. If you look at the spectrum and we say we have SaaS, which has a high market
Software as a service. Yes.
for
Hmm.
the service, that's right, which has a massive market following, but also has a low IP moat.
Yep.
And you have biotech, which requires 10 years minimum to get up to phase 3 FDA,
Yeah.
right? And it has a high IP moat, but investors don't see a dollar until that exits or until that gets acquired or the
Right.
company goes IPO. You have these two, and we realize that the semiconductor industry is right in the middle.
Mm.
We're talking about now saying chips have a high IP moat, low regulatory environment, and a massive following in terms of if you're able to get it implemented.
Yeah. Hmm.
Now, the other part is we started to look at the environment in terms of investing and in terms of the accelerators and some of the stuff out there. What we realized was that much of the technology that was being developed was sure, it could be very cutting edge, but is it actually implementable? So,
Right. That's the knock on quantum, because I think people understand it, AP physics back in the day, man. I got my taste of my quantum of quantum, I guess, back in high school. So like you kind of understand some of the underlying fundamentals, and that it is getting back to, Thomas Kuhn. It is like a paradigm shift to kind of go to a different underlying technology for quantum. That's where it's another one of those things. One of my favorite futurist jokes is, if you ask a futurist, when is something going to happen? When is their prediction going to happen? They either say it already has, or, it's just about to happen. So like, it's more a question of when, and then how do we know how close we are today? And how do you kind of assess the fact that this technology is maturing and we're actually getting in a more, almost like a 5-year horizon, which is when I think it starts to become more interesting to folks.
well, 100%. And so, where I'm going with this is one of the challenges has been, and this is something I learned when I was at the bank, is being able to find an overarching corporate alignment. So, in other words, you need to be able to say, this is how the technology fits into your overall corporate strategy.
I see.
So I was speaking at an event at The Economist, the magazine,
Hmm.
and they had an impact event on quantum, and the topic was bridging the digital divide. Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
So the question what we were talking about was, well, okay, there is obviously a great market dominance from American companies, obviously from a standpoint of innovation. in terms of the quality of what quantum companies are able to do, right?
Yeah.
American companies are obviously taking the lead.
Yes.
Now, there is this, intrinsic concern amongst global leaders in saying we don't want to be left behind as part of the global
Yeah.
or part of the quantum revolution, right?
Quantum FOMO. Yes.
Exactly. Right. In the same way, right? You take a look at what the dot-com bubble was, right? Or, go back to 1995, right?
Yeah.
When, the US was obviously one of the first to really have the internet, to be that digitally enabled,
Yep.
have e-commerce, right? To start these various companies, right? Obviously you saw the advent of Microsoft, Amazon. Obviously Microsoft came earlier, but these companies really, really, really taking on the mantle of the digital environment. And you still, IBM was still producing laptops, right? And so you look at that and you say, now there's this FOMO. Now, the question that I asked is, well, what do you want quantum computing to solve for you?
hmm
And so it became a little bit of a circular argument to say, well, we still want to be able to have access to it. I'm like, yes, but great. But what do you actually want it to solve?
Yeah.
As an American, I can say, with full certainty, we have already seen how technologies that we have developed at home have been used to build the things that in some ways have been used against us,
Right.
right? We didn't need to give the internet to the rest of the world, right? And
Right. Right. Yeah.
to give Windows to everyone. Obviously it became a great thing in terms of enlightenment, in terms of opening education,
Yeah. Right.
right? All of these various things, but somehow we have to be able to say, great, the world should have access to these things,
Yeah.
but we need to be able to set some guardrails.
And that's kind of the new footing, geopolitically for at least through the next 4 years through 2028 is that there's a little more of like, what's in it for us? We may be the world leader, but how do we sort of develop these technologies in such a way that if we have an advantage in terms of our intellectual property, our know-how, how do we leverage that? That is a shift that we're starting to see on the global stage.
And I think, some people would say that, we need to have open development forums and, I would say open source and whatnot, which by the way, in general, I'm very
Yeah.
favorable.
hmm
But I think it's a question of now, when we're giving people this education, obviously, part of America's strength has always been that we have been a bastion of education, right?
Yeah.
And so we've been able to enlighten many different parts of the world in
Yeah.
terms of education and areas.
This is one of the main concerns, I think, around the Trump administration's relatively aggressive footing vis-a-vis US higher ed, where, from an industry and innovation R&D perspective, I get concerned when I hear that may be less well funded because to many of your points today, there's a very deep connection between research that happens in higher ed and then innovation that really transforms the world around us.
So I think, first of all, in terms of what the administration is looking to do, and that obviously this is my own personal
Yeah,
opinion.
we're not I try not to be too political on the pod, but yeah.
Oh, fair enough. But I think it's important to, appreciate one thing, which is the main goal of any higher education institution is to be able to educate the next generation of people who will be able to take up the mantle of being able to create new businesses, create new opportunities to
Yep.
educate even the next generation after us, right?
hmm
To be able to, for them to have the right skill sets to be able to do that.
Yeah.
I think there is no secret that some higher education institutions have steered somewhat away from that in some ways, right? I think that when higher ed is objective to that point, there's a lot of great successes that have been really drawn out of that. I think that being able to give, for example, scientists the right outlets at these institutions to be able to do the research that they need, I
Yeah.
is a great asset. But I think the more important asset out of all of these is, at the end of the day, is it able to provide students, both undergrads and graduate students, with the right skills so that they
Yeah.
contribute in the right ways.
Right. And arguably those skills are going to be transformed by some of the technology waves that we're looking at. again, generative AI is almost in our rearview mirror now, but it's a change where, even if it is like the dot-com era, where there was a bit of a overinvestment, a bit of a hype bubble, it's not like we went back to pre-dot-com after the early 2000s. Like, there's really no going back in terms of some of these innovations. And then what do we as humans and we as educators and folks who are thinking about higher ed and elsewhere, what are those skills? And are those skills being transformed, in relation to the technology ecosystem that we're talking about?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, as a matter of fact, when you looked at, the Trump administration was very upset with Tim Cook recently about his move to move a plant from China to India, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the complaints that Tim Cook made, which was, I think, a very, very strong indicator, and I think, frankly, a little bit of a dig at the US education system, was he said, and I quote, we don't have enough engineers, right? Or we
Yeah.
don't have people who are actually skilled
Mm.
in the engineering skill set that we need in order
Yeah.
to be able to accommodate what we need to do. And,
Right.
and basically the argument was, well, India does. Right?
Yeah. I mean, and, just to defend, the US, they're about 3 times as big as us.
Sure. But
But also that was a little defensive. I think we do understand that their educational system it's a real asset. I think it's a great point. I actually hadn't heard someone make that point. Frequently folks talk about, the higher ed in the US as sort of this jewel that, we need to protect and, it's, at risk. I hadn't really made the connection to how, in many ways India has a similar leverage point in terms of their post-secondary education system.
well, that's right. I mean, look, this is a feather in their hat. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more of I mean, you look at some of the engineers who are graduating at some of these institutions. I was very fortunate where I had a lot of practical experience during my time in academia.
Yeah.
And I had some great experiences with some really great professionals, both in corporate and in the academic space.
Yep.
They gave me some really hands-on experience in working either in a plant or in a lab, or where I could actually work with my hands and not sit in front of a computer.
Right.
Many times you have a lot of academic institutions where you have some graduates graduating from engineering programs and they've never picked up a hammer.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, or they never picked up a solder, or they've never picked
Right.
up, these really what you would call primitive now
Mm.
skills. But it's not a question of being able to apply those skills in the future. It's being able to actually have the intuitive nature,
Mm.
having those skills and understanding then what could be the problem that I want to solve in the future. Just having that intuition of being able
Yeah.
to experience some of that.
I like where you're going with that too, because like when we talk about future skills, one of the things, we tend to be human centered and we try to think about where we'll have differentiation and, still have value to provide in terms of the future of work. And the idea of almost training your intuition and exposing almost like your embodied intelligence and some of the more like mechanical human intelligences that really are not easy to replicate if you think about where AI and other technology is going to go. Like, this is where I guess I'm also hashtag Team Kirk for your Star Trek fans out there.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think where I'm simply going with this is when we then start to talk about, the quantum space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we look at what's happening in quantum, the engineers that are in the quantum space right now, do they have enough of an education on the modalities, right? But then also when you then start to bring, quantum into the boardroom, right, of many
Yep.
institutions who are at the end of the day going to be users, can a quantum engineer be able to articulate the value that this technology will be able to bring, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is a very key element of this conversation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Talk about quantum being a game changer. There's a lot of excitement. Can most of the population explain it? Not really.
Right.
But what can they explain, right? What is it that's tangible for them? Will it allow for faster genomic sequencing? Potentially.
Yeah.
Is it absolutely necessary for genomic sequencing? It's not.
Yeah.
There are other techniques that can be used to optimize or compress data, right?
Right.
Optimal for example, like in the sensing space, quantum GPS. Absolutely.
That was the thing. And then getting back to your session at the Navy Yard,
Yep.
that was where I was really struck by, even getting back to the physicality, the innovation work, some of the research that's being done around like quantum GPS is being done, in the air. It's actually being done from a flight where you're turning off one mode of, triangulation or like figuring out your geolocation to like a different mode that is actually powered by quantum technology. That stuff was really interesting. Can you catch us up a little more on some of the details from that day? Because I did feel like I was mentioning when we were setting up, I learned a disproportionate amount of information in your sessions at the Navy Yard. Can we get into some of the specifics of the way the technology works and the research around it?
Yeah, so I think one of the really cool things with what's happening with, well, if we look at quantum GPS, there's a couple of different elements of this, right? Obviously, with qubits, the question really is how do you develop the qubits? Now, most of these
Yeah.
qubits have to be developed in really cold temperatures.
And the qubit is the alternative to the current bit technology, right? That's the Q with the letter Q for qubit, right? Yeah.
That's exactly right. Now, so you look at that and you say, okay, great. Could I put this in an autonomous vehicle? A computer of that size, right? As you've probably seen, these things could take up a room,
Yeah.
right? Could I put that in an autonomous vehicle? Could I put that on a ship? Could I put that on an aircraft? And then you realize, that's not really something that's feasible. Now, the technology development, which I think you saw when you were at the New York Deep Tech Week, which was amazing for us to have been one of the funds selected to do that,
Yeah.
we're actually able to take that and say, okay, let's use something called neutral atom technology and create an interferometer, which allows you to sort of take the manipulation of, and I would say the delta of those atoms, right? And really, or rather qubits in this case, right? And be able to manipulate those qubits for directionality purposes, right? So basically you're creating a way to see the movement, almost like a compass, but
Yeah.
really it's a solid state compass and be able to use that as a calibration point, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Really awesome because then that means that you're able to create a GPS that is not based on satellites at all.
Right.
Now, what's really funny about that, and we were talking about space, right, is that that lattice that you saw at Deep Tech Week, that lattice that was created by Inflection actually is now in use on a system called Albert, which is at the International Space Station done in coordination with NASA and the
Mm.
Propulsion Lab.
Mm.
That technology means that you can put that into an environments where you don't require cooling, but all of this technology can be done at room temperature,
Mm.
which is great. So what's really nice about the Inflection team is they're acting more like an Intel by using the same platform across
Yeah.
applications and less like simply saying we're just a computing firm, because
Right.
so we're now seeing that there are a lot of other applications, things like quantum radio frequency technology, right? For signal,
Right. Mm-hmm.
quantum GPS, timekeeping, right? For synchronization and data set,
Right. Right.
which can optimize everything from power use to processing alignment to
Mm-hmm.
even like for stock trades, it's a lot more efficient in terms of being timestamps.
Right.
You're just looking at all of this and saying, I just went through a whole bunch of use cases, but we're now talking about real life application, not something that's just hypothetical in terms of saying, yes, we're going to manipulate qubits.
Right. Right. And the other thing about qubits that I've been talking to folks about since your event is this idea of Q Day. And I think Gradient Technologies was another company that demoed there, which was kind of like stealth multi-factor authentication that would sort of get you past the risk of passwords being hacked. I thought that was an interesting sci-fi kind of scenario that is not too far off in the future, where like you can start to extrapolate, the power of this mode of processing versus other modes, and then the point at which it can kind of brute force break through some of the credential protocols that are out there. That to me was pretty enlightening. Can you catch folks up a little more on, and also if I'm stating stuff terribly badly, please correct me because I'm still learning, but I was struck by the fact that there will be, if you extrapolate this stuff out, there'll be sort of breakthroughs that are introducing new risks in addition to some upside.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, if we want to be very realistic, I don't see, I mean, we talked about Q day, right? Well, right now, I mean, we still have RSA 256, which is, one of the key encryption standards, right? And I know we've also, many companies have also been working on quantum encryption.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm going to say is I don't know if we're going to see this dynamic of, Q day, as you call it, as a fully realistic concern yet.
Okay.
I think it may be in the future, but when we still have conventional encryption, which is still, it's still not being broken,
Yeah.
I think then, we have to look at, okay, well, what can we actually break and what can we not break?
Hmm.
Let's say it this way. If you are in research and saying, look, we should research this and absolutely go to innovation, 100%.
Yep.
I think the government is a key proponent of being able to look at this and say, we need to solve this problem
Yep.
on the possibility that it actually gets there.
Yep.
But if you're sitting in a boardroom and you're saying, well, what is my ROI on this?
Right.
You're basically going to have to, I mean, yes, you'll probably have one of the most secure systems in the world.
Right.
Right. But again, what is the ROI for that?
Right.
I think, right now we have some pretty secure systems. I mean, I think that there are some holes in areas such as the authentication space,
Yeah.
which one of our companies, Radiant,
Yeah.
should be solved, right? And
Hmm.
the need for YubiKeys and remove the need for, I would say, non-hardware authenticated access, right? Which is what they've really pioneered, is being able to use some of the hardware attributes and consistent authentication to be able to make
Yeah.
their systems in the world. And so I think that we need to look at this again from this practical point of view.
Yeah.
Who is going to buy this, right?
Right. Mm.
If we want to say, look, the company is going to be based on research grants, I think there's something there. Now, I do want to point out an interesting phenomenon for your listeners, which I think is, given that many of them are in academia in some way,
Yeah.
quantum made a very interesting leap at one point, which is it decided that it wanted to leave academia early.
Mm.
Why? And the reason was they really wanted to discuss having most of the IP outside of the institutions.
Hmm.
So in other words, you're taking the IP and you've licensed a part of it, but then there's much more to develop.
Yep.
Now, the problem is that, many of the companies were told, or many of the VCs and investors, that by 2025, we would have full fidelity, with logical qubits and programmability all available at our fingertips.
Hmm.
And this was something that was going to be inevitable.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you take a look at the majority of the quantum firms that are out there today that are, commercial or have some capability, much of the work that they're doing is still in research.
Yep.
We sat down with a group at McKinsey and we basically looked at the revenue that most of these quantum companies were producing.
Yeah.
90% of it, with exception of grant funding, right, obviously, but 90% of it was proof of concept work.
Right.
Or some collaborative research project had
Yeah.
to do with an impact on the balance sheet.
Right. Well, some might connect that to kind of the state of, arguably AI was in an AI winter prior to, I mean, it was thawing clearly, but by the time, the fall of 22 came around, there were some meaningful breakthroughs. And then there was, arguably, the peak of inflated expectations. But, long term, it does seem like that technology, there's no going back. Is it similar positioning around quantum now, or are we at a much earlier stage?
Well, and so this goes back to my point about what are you using quantum for?
Hmm. What about quantum for AI?
If you look at OpenAI, right? OpenAI from the beginning had a very big vision, which was the possibility of replacing the search engine,
Hmm.
right? So instead of having a search engine, you could have OpenAI, right? And it could do a lot more, right? On a
Mm.
practical perspective, right? I mean, everything from legal
Yeah.
documents to memes to you name it.
What's funny is when you said that, I almost felt like I was in a pitch conversation, from however many years ago, where in place for placing a Google search with OpenAI, the name suddenly makes sense in that context.
right? And so then you look at that and you say, well, great, that's an awesome business model. Because basically, if you look at what, obviously Google and its various subsidiaries, Maps and Android and whatnot, they've
Mhm.
all been centered on being able to create this ecosystem around Google search.
Yeah. Hmm.
Now, obviously, OpenAI and the AI teams there have been some of the most disruptive technologies for these industries, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Really challenged everything from, rather than having to go through a list of, for example, on various ads, right? And being able to have what you would call the hamster wheel of AdWords,
Right.
now have
Yeah.
dynamic where it will always give you the best result.
Mm-hmm.
It will always give you the most targeted result. It will always give you the
Yeah.
most necessary information based on your ask.
Assuming there's no confabulations. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let's just say it this way: OpenAI is not DeepSeek.
Yeah.
Tiananmen Square did happen.
Yeah.
We have video proof. Right? So I think it's a question of, okay, great. It will give you the most relevant result.
Yeah. And it's still early. It'll continue to get better.
It will continue to get better, and it will, but it's getting better on a fundamentally different platform, and it's a
Mhm.
fundamentally different business model. And obviously, it's already challenged. Even like, for example, we talked about earlier the build versus buy model, right?
Yeah.
It's already challenged that too,
For
right?
sure.
And you
It's a great
can
example.
program or get code bases from OpenAI.
It's why AI services are a really interesting space now, where, it's more how to operate in an innovation landscape where this technology is maturing like under your feet.
Well, funny enough, there's a company I've been advising called Intelligenic, and they're actually launched. They have a beta program. They have a wait list for it to be able to. The question then became, okay, well, what do you ask OpenAI, right?
Mhm.
What do you ask an
Yeah.
engine? How do you actually build a product, right?
Hmm.
And so, at the end of the day, one of the challenges that quantum semiconductors and even the AI space all have is adoption,
Yeah.
right? Quantum AI is just simply saying, look, we're going to put a much nicer processor on it. Maybe we'll be able to process more information a lot faster. Maybe AI will be able to do what, Guilfoyle in what's it called? Silicon Valley, if you watch the show,
Yeah. Sure.
right? In terms of compressing packets and breaking through all of these various
We need that middle out.
expressions.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll look at that and say, wow, maybe that's what it will enable us to do. Very possible.
Hmm.
We need to get to the point of we need more adoption. We need more ability for people to have access to the technology in a secure environment. And we need more ability for people to be trained on these technologies. And so all of this comes back to a really fundamental point. Education needs to be able to adjust to these new paradigms.
Yeah.
It needs to be in more lockstep with what businesses and the tech environment is doing. Teaching people, there's a back and forth about whether kids should program. Right.
Right. Hmm.
I still believe that they should, even though that OpenAI exists and all this exists.
Yeah.
Going back to the hammer example that I talked about, you still want the intuitive nature of being able to carry a hammer.
Yeah. I agree. Well, especially when folks talk about the human in the loop, this is where Ethan Mollick, I quote him on this regularly. He's like, be the human in the loop, so like actually have the skills and competencies so that you can actually check the emerging technology and look at it critically, but also with a deeper intuitive understanding, but also like a deeper, mastery of the domain. A lot of what I hear is, connecting general durable skills with some deeper domain knowledges that you can actually tether the general skills to, because you don't want to just be a generalist. Like you're a good example of this, where like having the underlying expertise in engineering and some of the sciences, and then sort of generalizing that into, the broader skills around general management and venture capital. It's important to be able to do both things. I want to make sure we have time to kind of hit on more takes from you on the education space. It sounds like you were just touching on it a little bit too, just around, the talent gaps in the US. Like, are there things you think people should be doing? Are there ideas that folks who think about the future of education should be aware of or be thinking about?
I think at the end of the day, one of the most important parts of the education space today is being able for us to, I mean, frankly speaking, we need to put people to work.
Hmm.
In my opinion, especially from the engineering and scientist perspective, we have a lot of great people in this country. We have a lot of great scientists and great engineers. They should be in a position where not a single one of these students is coming out without a job or
Right.
opportunity of a job. And
Hmm.
that we need to be very cognizant of how we do that, how we offer those opportunities. I think two things need to happen to make that happen. One is academia and the corporate environments need to be much more aligned in how they are setting up curricula, how they are setting up teaching styles, how they are setting up practicums for these students to be able to get engaged.
Yeah. Internships and like exposure to work life earlier into post-secondary and even, secondary on back, right?
So I think we've just leaned way too far to the academic space,
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
academic side, and I think applied got at some point sort of left behind.
Yeah. Mm.
We need to do a better job of that.
Yeah.
It takes, even from some of the top institutions, engineers are spending 2 or 3 years trying to, acclimate and get the right other skill sets, and companies are spending the time to do that. We don't have the time for that right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Coming out and getting upskilled right on the get go or be able to hit the ground running. And I
Yeah.
think what other countries are doing, right? And,
Yeah.
students are going out and they're able to do that. And then I think the other thing is, especially from the professorial side, you know, we hold a great reverence for the many professors and academics that we have.
Yeah.
But, I think there is a key reminder, especially from the technology side, that much of the technology that is out there today, in some ways, has outpaced academia.
Yeah.
I think that it would be of great value for academia in general to try and start to upskill professors, right?
Mm.
On some of these new concepts. And many of these new concepts are coming from startup world, right?
Yeah.
And then last but not least, and this one is a very controversial one,
Nice. I like that.
we need to remove the ego out of academia.
Mm.
And I'll give you the perfect understanding of what I mean by that is, you have many, obviously publications are a big part of validation of whether
Yeah.
technology is real or not. I think to some extent, it is great to have published work, but I think published work at some point needs to have, and I think, I would challenge, key publications to do this, is to be able to actually say, and maybe do this in coordination either with venture capital or do this in coordination with analysts at banks or do this in other places, in asking the question, why does this matter?
Hmm.
And it's not just for the scientists, it's also for everyone else who wants to be able to read these papers and maybe want to just, they read the summary and they say, you know what? Okay, this is really interesting. There's obviously a lot of math and a lot of
Yeah.
conceptual understanding in terms of some of the innovation that's being produced. But the actual fundamental value
Yeah.
is of great importance here.
Right.
And so I think it would be of great value to not just the scientific community, but also the community at large in order to make that case.
That's interesting. When you talk about that too, it's another application of AI that I would think about where like just filtering the long academic journal articles to say like, what's a practical application here? And then same thing, when you're talking, it did make me think about patents as well, where like, how much of higher ed is focused on the intellectual property. And then getting back to your earlier point, which I think is a really interesting and sharp one, is like how much of the folks who can get patents and can get their IP protected in some way, how many of them are staying at university versus going out on their own. Really interesting stuff here. I'm talking to Charles Beyrouthy, who is the managing partner at a venture firm called Forma Prime. Getting close to conclusion here, although clearly there's plenty to talk about in this space. We didn't get into some of the sensor technology that you're also interested in, some of the ways in which we can kind of multispectral imaging was really interesting. Any lightning round stuff you want to make sure we hit on before we wrap up here, Charles?
I think there needs to be, just as an overall theme as a country today, we are experiencing a lot of movements. One of the things you mentioned to me about, the tariffs, which I think I just wanted to point out is,
Yeah.
we talked about Taiwan. One of the key reasons, that the tariffs, there was a discussion about tariffs on Taiwan was because, and this will bring this full circle. At the end of the day, if God forbid something was to happen to Taiwan,
Yeah.
many of us would be left exposed. We saw
Right.
this during COVID.
because of the supply chains for the chips. They're only manufactured in Taiwan.
Exactly, 100%. And so there are three things that need to happen. The tariffs were there not because we were trying to punish Taiwan. The tariffs were there because we wanted to adjust the behavior of corporates who were buying their chips from TSMC in Taiwan and be able to make it so that their behavioral changes would be US-based fabs. Additionally, as a result of this, TSMC invested $100 billion in the United States to build fabs here. And so now that we're building the fabs here, it is now on us to not just be able to help make those viable by obviously helping corporations to change the supply chain. Also, on the one hand, be able to embed engineers into the corporations that are able to have, especially from the device side, enough semiconductor knowledge, to be able to design better boards, better chips, better sets, right, for devices. But then also for the educators to be able to start to put in place programs to be able to start putting engineers.
Yeah, like a whole workforce effort.
We need 35,000 at minimum technicians to be in these plants.
Yeah.
And we don't have enough of them. And we're not moving fast enough. Our team has been looking at options, and we're working on a few secret projects, which I won't talk about today, to be able to help upskill that and work with academic institutions. But the point is this: we need the educators to step forward and to be able to help put these people to work and get these people started. Because now it is not a matter of just simply saying, oh, we get chips or we don't get chips. Because of everything from either your phones to your laptops to the base devices, your medical devices, right? Servers.
The new medallion that Johnny Ive is making with Sam Altman, right? That's going to need chips.
Everything. And we need to be able to produce these in a secure environment, and we need to be able to produce them here, and we need to be able to do it now. So what I'm saying is this is a real call to action. And so the academic community is saying, well, how do we step in? How do we support? This is exactly what you do. Do what you do best and actually give the practical skills. And if you don't know what exactly the practical skills are, talk to someone.
Right.
A phone call. The executives are happy to sit down. I'm happy to sit down with anybody with questions and be able to say, let's get this right and develop something that can actually be implementable and actually, in reality, practical for this application. It's a matter of national security.
Amazing stuff here. A call to action at the end there. Hopefully higher ed is listening, and there's a lot of education work that is very much baked into everything we talked about today. So I appreciate you proselytizing a little bit about quantum technology and what's emerging, and then also giving us perhaps some glimpses into what the future might hold for us. Charles Beyrouthy, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me, Mike.
And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, please subscribe. We'll include links to the companies we talked about in the show notes for the episode. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.